Welcome to U.S. History, Creating a Nation. Today we're talking about Chapter 1, Section 1, Converging Cultures, and we're going to look at how our nation was created. We're going to be looking at a couple of big ideas here. We're going to talk about comparing historical evidence, and we're going to talk about what happens when cultures collide. For instance, what happens when the Europeans and the native peoples meet. And we're also going to talk about how does geography affect peoples. For instance, what is the difference in the colonies based on their climate? A long time ago when I was in school, the founding of our country was all a bit fuzzy to me. There was some sort of an ice bridge, and Columbus came over, and then there was Thanksgiving, and George Washington beat the Nazis or something like that. You know, America. Well, we all know that it's a bit more complicated than that. But how did the first people get here? Well, there was a land bridge, we know that much. But we needed some evidence, and in 1925 a cowboy named George Majunkin found some arrowheads near Clovis, New Mexico. So we were pretty confident that America was settled about 10,000 years ago by people who came over following big animals to hunt. Pretty much like the movie Ice Age. Well, maybe not. The good thing is that using archaeology, that's the arrowheads, we're able to know about when the first people came around. In other words, we go through people's trash to find out about them. But how do we know how old someone's trash is? How do we know how old these arrowheads are? Well, we use science. The spear points on the left are our Clovis points that George Majunkin found in a buffalo carcass. The type of buffalo had been extinct for 10,000 years. And later we found more Clovis points and more trash, and through something called radiocarbon dating, we can tell how old the trash is around these arrowheads. You don't have to know how that works, but I'll throw in a link to it if you're interested. But then we found more trash, and there we found spearheads older than 10,000 years ago. These are called Solutrean points, and these seem to be 30,000 years old. And they match spearheads that European people were making, not Asian people. So that's a big gap. 10,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, what do we know? Well, sometime between 10,000 and 30,000 years ago, people showed up, and that they either walked over from Asia or paddled little boats over from Europe. If that seems a little hazy, that's okay. Just remember, whether it was 10,000 or 30,000 years ago, it was a long time ago. And remember the lesson, history changes as our methods and our sources get better. In any event, we're pretty sure that about 30,000 or maybe 10,000 years ago, a bunch of people showed up and started working towards civilization in what's now the Americas. And they built some pretty impressive civilizations. They started mainly in Central America, and we find evidence of big cultures like the Maya, the Anasazi, and the Aztec. While the Maya and the Anasazi died out, probably from a combination of war, bad luck, and using up all of their resources, there were a ton of native people when the Spanish showed up around 1500. In fact, according to the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in what is now Mexico City was bigger than Paris, with floating islands, formal gardens, and a population of over 200,000. So it was probably the largest city in the world, but without raw sewage in the streets, as was common in Europe at the time. There were also a number of large tribes throughout North America. As you look at the map here, or on page 100, try and note where some of these tribes were located, and see how their names tell us about their location. I'll give you a hint. The Delaware. Where do you think they were located? Okay, now we've got a bunch of native people, but where's Columbus? And when does George Washington show up? Easy now, we'll get there. Christopher Columbus gets all the press, and he's important. But before Columbus showed up, there were Vikings who likely set up in Canada. Not to mention a bunch of cod fishermen who weren't afraid to sail all over the world. So, why does Columbus get all the press? Well, the Vikings and fishermen were looking for fish. Fishermen don't like to tell you where fish are coming from because other people will go steal their fish. And the Vikings were only sort of amateur colonials. And frankly, their society died off around the end of the Middle Ages. But Columbus, he was a successful businessman, and he would start the major rush to colonization. So the Spanish take the lead in exploration, and they did some amazing stuff. I find exploration amazing, and while on the one hand these guys are responsible for some terrible acts, there is no denying their incredible accomplishments. Look at our map. Cortez explored in Mexico and Pizarro in Peru, and they overcame huge empires with just a handful of soldiers. Juan Ponce de Leon explored through Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth. Coronado explored deep into the mountains and deserts of the American West looking for El Dorado, the lost city of gold, and De Soto explored far up the Mississippi. They settled colonies in what is now Florida, Mexico, and California. The English and the French were late to the game, but they would rapidly take a lead in the colonization of North America. For the French, Champlain, La Salle, and Cartier would explore what's now Canada, whereas the English would focus on what is now the United States. The first colony or attempted colony by the English was a town called Roanoke. It's known as the colony that vanished. No one knows what really happened at Roanoke. The colony was settled, someone went home, when they came back they were gone with some cryptic messages scribed into the wood. Whether they simply went and joined a Native American tribe, or as a more recent historian thinks, they were slaughtered and killed to every last man, woman, and child. But Jamestown would be founded in Virginia and would eventually grow to be a successful colony. But not at first. Jamestown was settled as a joint stock colony, so it was to make money, and the first settlers who came over were looking to make a quick buck. But they spent most of their time digging for gold when they should have been planting crops and preparing for the long winter. When no gold was found and no crops miraculously appeared, they resorted to fighting the Indians and in some cases resorting to cannibalism. Not a great moment. However, eventually they'd start planting tobacco, which would prove to be a lucrative cash crop and help them have success. That's when we get to the Pilgrims, right? You know, the Mayflower, religious freedom, belt buckles on the heads and whatnot. Well, the Pilgrims did indeed come over on the Mayflower. They were trying to get to Virginia, but Plymouth, Massachusetts would do just fine. The Pilgrims were looking for religious freedom from England and opportunity. And they did in fact have somewhat of a Thanksgiving. It was not turkey and pumpkins. What it was deer and corn and shellfish and roasted meat. But there was this historical legacy of a first Thanksgiving. And as far as the Buckles go, well, that was the Puritans who would later come to run much of Massachusetts. The original Pilgrims tended to dress more colorfully, like this gentleman here. Well, if the only thing that the Pilgrims and the Indians had ever traded were pumpkins and turkey and tobacco, the world would be very different. But the arrival of the Europeans led to what we call the Columbian Exchange. We see massive amounts of trade, products going from Europe to the New World, such as coffee beans and turnips and peaches, and cattle and pigs and, oh yeah, smallpox. There were some things that went from the New World to Europe, and they're pretty famous in what we think of as Thanksgiving, like pumpkins, squash, and turkeys, and also peanuts and corn and tomatoes. But if you had to ask what the most important legacy of the Columbian Exchange was, well, remember, there were millions of people living here before Columbus. Okay, where did they go? First, to summarize, we had a bunch of natives that came over, either from Europe or from a land bridge, and then we had some explorers like Cortez and Columbus. Well, how many Indians were there to start with? We used to think that there were only about 1 million, but more recent evidence suggests that it was more like 100 million. And they weren't just running around in the woods, scrabbling for existence. They were living in walled cities up and down the East Coast, throughout Central and South America. There were quite a few of them. So the question is, what happened to them? Well, they didn't just leave. The first 50 towns that European settlers came to and settled were actually abandoned Indian towns. And the tribes didn't just move on. An English trader named Thomas Morton noted that there were incredible piles of bones, like Golgotha, which is the hill of execution when Rome ruled Jerusalem. So the tribes didn't move out of town, they just died. And they died so fast they couldn't even get buried. So what would you say was the most important item that was part of the Columbian Exchange? If you said smallpox, you could make a strong case. But I find it interesting that history does change. 1 million, 100 million. New evidence changes our understanding of history. So as we go through the year, we always want to challenge our understanding of facts and look really closely at our sources. So Native Americans show up, then explorers, then colonies. So let's wrap up with a quick discussion of our American colonies. We started with Jamestown in Virginia, then the Pilgrims in Massachusetts. And the U.S. will grow rapidly as people from mostly England come over looking for religious freedom, economic opportunity, or just a new life. We'll divide the colonies into three sections: New England, the Middle States, and the South. This helps us understand how they grow, how their economies develop, and later, why they all choose up sides and fight the Civil War. Let's start with New England. New England is characterized by rocky soil and colder weather. It's got people who would mostly therefore work on small farms, fishing, boat building, or trading. New England is also closely associated with religious freedom in America and ideals of democracy. It was founded by the Pilgrims at Mayflower, who were looking for religious freedom, and later the states of Rhode Island and Connecticut would be founded as people were trying to get away from the serious Puritans who had taken over Massachusetts. And all of these places would have written ideas about democracy, which we'll be talking about in tomorrow's work. The Mid-Atlantic colonies consisted of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Delaware. They were founded by the more tolerant Dutch in the case of New York, or with some specific ideas of religious tolerance, as was the case in Pennsylvania. The Mid-Atlantic colonies had pretty good weather, but it was not well suited for the plantation crops of the Deep South. The middle colonies would be growers of food crops and home to New York and Philadelphia, two of the richest merchant cities in the colonies. The southern colonies were controlled by a few wealthy plantation owners. There were plenty of people here, but the poor and middle class tended to move inland to grow food crops on smaller farms. They weren't often allowed to vote. And warm weather and fertile ground made it ideal for the labor-intensive cash crops of cotton and tobacco. This would lead for a greater demand for slaves. The South would grow cash crops, and the growth of slavery would later rip the U.S. apart. By the time of the American Revolution in 1775, there were 540,000 slaves in the colonies. They made up about 20% of the population. The big reason for the rapid growth of the number of slaves was the triangular trade. Look at our illustration. You'll see that there are lots of possible triangles, but the basic idea is slaves go to America, raw goods like cotton go to England, and finished goods go to Africa to sell or trade for slaves. So everyone was getting rich by enslaving people. So let's look at what we've learned. We've talked about comparing historical evidence. What are two types of evidence we've looked at in our discussion of history? I'll give you a hint. Arrowheads. If we had to look at evidence about Clovis points and Solutrean points, can we make cases for when America was established as being either 10,000 years ago or 30,000 years ago? We've looked at the relationship between geography and history in our nation. How are the colonies established? How did geography and geology and weather affect how the colonies of the New England states, the Middle States, and the South were created? And we've got some ideas we can evaluate. Is it always about progress? Do things always get better? And do they get better for everyone? Well, that's not a simple question. What would the Native Americans say? What do you think Columbus would say? This is a theme we're going to be carrying all year, so there's not one right answer, but it's important food for thought. And this brings us up to the eve of the revolution. We'll get carried on with that tomorrow.